right, so we're looking at the Reconstruction Part Two, where we're continuing to look at what was going on with Reconstruction. We finished with the kind of failure of Andrew Johnson to really enforce any of the initial requirements to join the Union that he had initially stated he was going to do, and how that ultimately led to each of the southern states creating their own black codes. So we're going to look now at kind of the disenchantment with Andrew Johnson and the shift to radical Republicans and congressional reconstruction as they kind of push out Johnson and try to do it themselves. So one of the things I want to look at, well, we can talk about the goals, and then I want to look at also petitions to Andrew Johnson, because there was, still a few attempts to work with Johnson initially. That's eventually going to go out the window altogether. But they do try. There are people that do try initially to continue to work with Johnson, even though that they're disappointed with how things are going. So the goals for the Republicans were the radical Republicans were equality of the people, and specifically leading to citizenship. They felt that it was important that the former slaves were given citizenship and voting rights and equality, which, of course, not surprisingly, the South was largely against, and Johnson was against. There are also, of course, the more moderate Republicans who had a variety of opinions. So this is just the radical Republicans that were pushing for this agenda, not all Republicans. Then, as I mentioned, voting rights was part of their goals to include, as well as what they were hoping would be to expand the power of the federal government. And the reason for this was because, right, the southern states, and Johnson was a big proponent of states' rights and their independence. But of course, that had led to the Black Codes and other problems. And so they wanted to push to extend the power of the federal government over the South in forcing Reconstruction, if you will. And of course, eventually what one of their goals becomes is just straight up to be against Andrew Johnson. As it becomes clear that he's going to push back against everything that they have tried to set up. They are going to just be pretty much against everything that he does. So let's look at one of the, so I'm thinking here with this, the Committee of Freedmen on Edisto Island, and this petition to Johnson for the land that they've been promised. So one of the things with the end of the Civil War, and specifically Sherman's March, was that under Sherman's March, as former slaves were fleeing the South, they started joining the line of soldiers, but he didn't really want that. Because he was afraid that it would slow them down. They had a specific timeline and plan, and so one of the things that became a statement that he promised was that people could have 40 acres and a mule. And the idea, I don't know why this is deleting here. The idea, of course, was that this would be former plantation owners' land and former Confederate land as well. And so many former slaves took over property and land that had been slave owners, and began, making it their own. And one of the things that Johnson did with the Reconstruction, as he declared that the states were unified, was to declare that the land of these former, after, of course, he had said, the large plantation owners, they should be punished, there should be all this harsh treatment. None of that happened. And on top of that, then he said, and also I'm going to give you back your land that you lost. So this petition is in response to that, and appealing to their right for that land. So if we look, it says, generally, we want homesteads. We were promised homesteads by the government. If it does not carry out the promises its agents made to us, if the government, having concluded to befriend its late enemies and to neglect to observe the principles of common faith between itself and us, its allies, and the war you said was over, now takes away from them all rights to the soil they stand upon, save such as they can get by again working for your late and their all-time enemies. So, of course, part of this is this idea of that we were promised, I don't know why it's not letting me write here. They're promised the land, and they make a huge emphasis on the enemies, much like the other petition as well. That was petitioning for the end of the Emancipation Proclamation, well, not the end of the Emancipation Proclamation, but the end of slavery in the border states that were not covered under the Emancipation Proclamation, right? It's trying to make the point, like, we were your allies, we supported you, you were fighting for us, and you're going to, return this to your enemies? That doesn't make sense. Right? And they do say we're at the mercy of those who are combined to prevent us from getting land enough to lay our father's bones. We have property and horses, cattle, carriages, furniture, and so on, right? But this idea of we don't have any, we're beholden to your decision on this, and we're asking you to make the right one. You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island. You only lost your right arm in war and might forgive them. Right? So they're saying, you're telling us to forgive them and give their land back, but you're the most that you suffered was a lost arm in war. We were tied to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, who would not let me stay in his empty hut, except I will do his planting and be satisfied with his price. Right? That how much more they were, right? That the grievances that they had for how they were treated, right? We should not have to forgive them of this horrible treatment, right? And then they, specifically saying, we have not been treacherous. We have not, for selfish motives, allied to us those who suffered like us from a common enemy. So that, like, this idea of, again, we're not the ones that were treasonous here. The state will make laws that we shall not be able to hold land, even if we pay for it landless, homeless, voteless. We only pray and hope, pray to God and hope for his help and your influence in settling this. So again, this recognition that if you take this away, there's going to be no other opportunity. Oops, I don't know why this is, I guess I'm being difficult here today. Let's not write it. There'll be no other opportunity. It's kind of sloppy anyways there. It's sorry, it's not really letting me write very well. There's no other opportunity. If you take this away from us, we will not have another way to obtain land. And so again, this as we saw with the other petition, this attempt to try to you constantly had former slaves petitioning for and fighting for their rights and their new freedoms, because this was a time of both getting these freedoms we saw with the expression of freedom and having them be taken away. Getting freedoms and having them be taken away. And just the hypocrisy of that, and attempts by many, many people, though we'll see the Freedmen's Bureau and Black populations pushing back and trying to enact change through the government to support them. This did not sway Johnson, though, and he did not support that, which not surprising considering everything else that took place. So the radical Republicans, like I said, and largely the Black population, had become increasingly disenchanted with Johnson. It became clear that he wasn't going to hold to what he originally said that he was going to do in terms of Reconstruction, and ultimately that they that he was going to basically allow the South to continue doing what they wanted to do, essentially. They had pushed for a dissolution of the governments. Andrew Johnson had claimed that that things were grand and everything was working fine. The radical Republicans said that those governments actually needed to be dissolved, and establish new ones, which is this expansion of federal power here, where rebels, like those that were, Confederate rebels, were not in charge of the governments, and black men were guaranteed the right to vote. Of course, for voting rights, right, you notice that it was only men with the right to vote. There was no discussion of women having the right to vote in this situation. So that's what the radical Republicans wanted to do, is actually push in federal government authority into the southern states, get rid of anyone who was considered had been a rebel, and controlling their government, so that they could essentially force Reconstruction, as they, the radical Republicans claimed it was not taking place. And, many claimed that that the whole structure of Southern society needed to be changed. But while radical Republicans supported this, for most people that was too radical. Some agreed that there needed to be protections. Some did not. But most did not think that they should fundamentally dismantle the entire Southern culture and society, as the radical Republicans had pushed for. And so what happens is that the Republicans largely were the majority. They were the majority in Congress. Not surprisingly, the South was underrepresented in Congress because of the Confederate States and secession and all of that. However, the party was not fully unified. They are going to become more unified as time goes on, but they were not fully unified at first because there were radical Republicans and moderate Republicans. So, again, there wasn't 100%, it's not all radical Republicans, essentially. Again, we'll see that more and more Republicans are going to come to oppose Johnson as time goes on. What happens is in early 1866, two bills were proposed. The one was the Civil Rights Bill. The other was the expansion. I'll put it up here. Oops. Oh, I need to figure out how to get the palm rejection, apparently, because it used to be on there. So the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to protect Black rights and interest in the South. They were there to help provide education, finances, land, and just overall protection of rights. And they wanted to expand the Freedmen's Bureau further. And then they proposed the 1866 Civil Rights Bill, which was defining all persons born in the United States as citizens, and spelled out the rights that they should have regardless of race. So with the Civil Rights Bill, the goal was full citizenship. They wanted to expand the Freedmen's Bureau under this as well. They wanted to establish that anyone essentially born in the United States, no matter race, right, had a right to citizenship, the ability to sue, to make contracts, to buy and sell property, right? And then, of course, as citizens, be able to vote. They also wanted to the Civil Rights Bill wanted to overturn the Dred Scott case. which had established that basically black people, not just slaves, black people could not be citizens. So by getting rid of the Dred Scott case that was before the Civil War, that had basically said all black people, no matter whether they're slave or free, could not be citizens, then that would remove any Supreme Court decision or federal state law that could, appeal to that as, but this law says this, right? Johnson vetoed this. And many were surprised. I'm not sure why. Like, Johnson was pretty clearly against this. But Congress was surprised that he outright vetoed all of this. I think they thought that he would come back with some counter argument or offer. Instead, he just straight up vetoed both of these. He said that this would deprive the states of authority to regulate their own affairs. He also basically straight up said that he didn't believe that black people deserved the rights of citizenship. Because by allowing them to secure rights, to secure their rights, Congress was essentially discriminating against white people. These vetoes of the expanded Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill helped push a lot of moderate Republicans over to the radical Republican side. And while at first they were not able to get enough to override his veto, you need 2/3 of Congress to override a presidential veto. It didn't take long before they had actually finally had enough support and were able to have the 2/3 to override it. So while the Civil Rights Bill initially stalled when they first attempted it, by April of 1866, it became the first major law in the U.S. history to be passed over a presidential veto. So Johnson vetoed this bill, right? And eventually they were able to get 2/3 of Congress to override his veto. That was the first time this happened. This is a big deal because this is part of the checks and balances of the United States government, is that Congress put forth laws, the president can either sign them or veto them, right? That's the presidential power check of Congress. So Congress is going crazy, the president can override those bills. But there's a check on the president, so the president can't just veto everything. Congress, if they get 2/3 majority, can override his veto. And then that's it. It forces it into law. The president can't do anything else to block it. However, it is throughout the history of the United States near impossible to get a 2/3 majority in Congress. There's too much division, and it's very difficult to do. It has not happened. The most it happens is during this period in time. And this was the first time that a major law had been overridden, the veto had been overridden to be passed. So it was a huge deal, not only, of course, getting the Civil Rights Bill in play, but also the fact that Congress came together and had a 2/3 majority to override Johnson is significant. And so this then coincides with the 14th Amendment. Let me put that up here. And the 14th Amendment essentially was put in place that the principle of citizenship for all people born in the United States, and allowed the federal government to protect the rights of Americans. It also prohibited states from blocking these privileges and immunities of citizens or denying them equal protection of the law. This is I think the broad language of this is important because it ultimately is going to open up the door for future Congresses and federal courts to give larger meaning to the idea of equality. It's still not fully there yet, but the kind of broad nature of this. So we can see, right, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state which they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, this is, of course, the South's going to get around this with Plessy v. Ferguson with segregation separate but equal, but it it still is important that this was put into place. It made the black codes unconstitutional and ends the black codes can't continue with this amendment. So that's important that they are then ended. And it, for a period in time at least, moves towards pushing for black equality within the United States, all by temporary, if you will. And as mentioned, it's broad enough language that it can be added to expand the idea of equality over time. This also talks about how that you can't deny citizenship and those rights unless, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, for being able to have your representative, whether that's voting, whether that's being in Congress. There's the rules about basically that you can't exclude representation in Congress unless they have participated in rebellion or other crime. It also sets that it's male citizens 21 years of age, right? So, right, it later gets moved to 18, but it doesn't actually start at 18. It's 21 years of age. So it's, still, that's not what we wanted to pop up. Hang on. Right, it's men 21 years old, but the key being born in the United States, right, equals citizenship, and the states cannot deny rights of citizens. Right, that's kind of the big part of that. So, this was a big deal that this got pushed, and what it did is it kind of created a full-out war between Johnson and Congress. So Andrew Johnson goes on speaking tours, and the whole point was to try to get support. Right, he wanted to fight back against Congress. So he wanted to get reelected, and he wanted support. And so what his goal was try to convince voters to elect members of Congress that were committed to his vision of Reconstruction. So he wanted support for himself, and he wanted support for we'll say Congress members who supported him. Right, his whole goal was on these speaking tours, besides, getting public support for himself, was to basically, if I get enough people elected into Congress that support me, then Congress won't be able to override me. Because, of course, a president loses a lot of power if they are just going to get overridden every veto they make. He essentially becomes a lame duck, if you will. So his hope was with these speaking tours was to, again, get support for himself and get people elected into Congress that would support and back him. Unfortunately for him, good for everyone else, all these speaking tours really did is upset people more, especially in the areas in the North when his opponents easily won. So his speaking tour backfired. It did not have the impact and effect that he wanted. And over the next thing that takes place is, here we go, the shift to congressional reconstruction, because over Johnson's veto, Congress adopts the Reconstruction Act. And this starts the phase of congressional reconstruction. So once again, Congress puts this forth, Johnson vetoes it, and they override it. What the congressional reconstruction did is that it divided the South into 5 military districts, and essentially allowed the radical Republicans to take over and try their vision at Reconstruction. And so the South was going to be divided up into 5 military districts, specifically under martial law. It's essentially until they behaved themselves, if you will, right? Oh, and here's a breakdown of the 14th Amendment. I could have just used this one to show. I forgot that was on there. That just kind of breaks down the points with that. Then the other thing that their goal was to attempt to restore the Union, with specifically creating a constitutional committee to try to make sure to get the rights of voting for all male voters, to improve African American voting rights, ratify the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment is going to be added later, and then create provisional governments to end those, the ones that were established by Johnson, to end those, and also have the military to protect voter registration, because as we're going to see, the South started intimidating people to try to prevent them from being able to vote and have those rights to vote. They also wanted to require that the Southern states and individuals had to take a loyalty oath to be restored to the Union. So their argument, of course, with their Congressional Reconstruction Act was that the South had not done enough to be considered the Union restored, as Johnson was claiming, and that these were all the steps that needed to take place. So for a while, as the Republicans were able to create some of this, right, it does open up protections and opportunities for Black people in the South that had been there, then been denied, and now were being restored again. The other thing that they did was the Tenure of Office Act, which specifically was looking at trying to be able to remove office holders that had been selected by the president. Because there were two parts to this. The one, there was trying to protect office holders that could, so that when Johnson was pissed at an office holder that didn't support him, he kept trying to remove them. And actually, this pissed off the Congress even more, because so you had these specific office holder positions. Okay. And many of these were originally like elected by the president. Oh, sorry, keep going on the wrong thing here. Everything keeps popping up. Okay, elected by the president and approved by the Senate. And Johnson had been trying to remove them and replace them. So essentially, right, you had these people that had been approved by the Senate, and then Johnson tried to come in and remove them and just replace them without approval from the Senate and put in lackeys, basically. And so what they were trying to do with this was prevent him from being able to do that. And so it said that you couldn't, the president couldn't remove them without Senate approval and approval of a replacement. And so this was meant to, it was directly targeting the people that had been put in by President Johnson, who they felt were illegally there. And they wanted them removed and put back the original people, or at least new ones that were approved by Senate, rather than people that Johnson had just kind of put in through this kind of loophole that existed. So they were essentially trying to shore up like all the ways that Johnson was trying to gain power, if you will. They did try to impeach Johnson, but they were one vote shy from being successful with it. So it was close. But of course, what does lead to happen is that because of the extreme dislike of Johnson, Grant is elected and is successful as elected as the next president. Johnson is not. And so this helps continue for the attempts to put in policies and rights of Reconstruction, right? And but the one thing that before the election of Grant, the one thing that the impeachment did do even though, again, they weren't successful in actually impeaching Johnson, is it forced Johnson to agree to the Reconstruction Act. And the reasons it didn't happen, I mean, it was really close, but one of the reasons it didn't happen is there wasn't a vice president at the time, because Johnson had been the vice president, right? Lincoln had been assassinated. So then there was a whole kind of concern of, if you impeach Johnson, who are we moving up to president? I mean, there's a line of secession, but the most, were kind of hesitant, even if they did end up voting for it, to not have a vice president just be there to step in. There was also, of course, economics and politics at place that influenced decisions as well. But again, I think one of the important things is it basically made Johnson acquiesce. He had to then support the Reconstruction Act. He stopped fighting with Congress. He kind of saw the writing on the wall that he was done. It's a clear case of, even without impeachment, Congress beat Johnson. He had no power or authority anymore in the government, and he finally recognized that, and then this led to the election of Grant. So with those changes, you have the 15th Amendment that comes in, and let's pull that one up here. So the 15th Amendment is the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and Congress has the power to enforce this. So both of those things are important with that, because one, of course, it protects voting rights, right? And says that, right, citizens of the United States, of course, one of the things that it's going to do is it's not, and that women are going to be unhappy with, that we'll look at in the next lecture, is that with the 14th and 15th Amendment, it limited it to those men that were over 21. Women were hoping that with the 15th Amendment that it would come in and it would include women as having those rights as well. It did not, and so we're going to look at how they try to push back on this to get the right to vote. But it basically said, if you're a citizen of the United States, then government and state level could not deny you the right to vote, right, based on race, color, and previous condition of servitude. Again, what women had hoped was that it would also say in women or gender, but it did not. Okay, so race, color, previous condition of servitude, citizens then could not be denied based on those things and their right to vote. The 15th Amendment was important at the time. It's going to get restricted, if you will, a little bit later. Again, when we talk about women pushing for them to be included in this, unfortunately, when they take the course to the Supreme Court with Minor v. Happersett, the Supreme Court's going to come back and say, well, voting's not a guaranteed right. But at the moment, it looks like it is. And certainly, at least the one right it does establish is that you can't deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which opened up, of course, the ability for Black men to vote in the South, which they were able to do for a while. And they also increased the emergence of freedoms and rights in several other areas with the election of Grant and the radical Republicans in Congressional Reconstruction, which opened up and allowed for political office holders, for former slaves and Black people in general to hold political office, to vote, to have property rights and court protections. All of these things are super important for rights for mostly Black men. We'll say Black people, but mostly men. Women were not really included within this aspect of it. But it is important because ultimately then you have this period where in the South, it was kind of like the early periods of expression of freedom, where they were allowed to have control. And there was a huge explosion of Black people that became involved in local political governments. I mean, and this is needed if you want to reshape the structure of the governments. If you want to ensure that these rights are protected, that's exactly what you want to do, is have people get into local governments that they're going to make and enact laws locally. And you did. You had people, not only Black people voting, but you had Black people running for office and being elected to office. You had people having the guaranteed right to be able to purchase property, to sue in court, which was one of their goals, to be able to make contracts, all things that allowed for businesses to be created, rights to be protected. And this happened for a little bit, but not surprisingly, at the same time that this was taking place, there was resistance, white resistance in the South to these changes. The South traditional leaders, the plantation owners, wealthy merchants, and Southern Democratic politicians were very much opposed to this new government structure. And they denounced the whole thing as like corrupt, inefficient, and of course in significant racist undertones, talked about how the whole thing was ruining the Southern government and culture and way of life. And so they wanted to get rid of that system, not surprisingly. They actually, what they called it, the Southern Democrats used the term restoring the South, which was also the other redeemers. They called themselves the Redeemers, right? We're redeeming or restoring the structure of the South, essentially, right? The other term they used is virtuous past, right? It was all this language kind of couched in, like the glorious past, the virtuous past, redeeming. It's intentional language to make it sound like they're on the right side of things, right? They argued that the culture and history was being challenged and destroyed by these new systems, of course, and the argument being directly because of Black people being involved in it and having rights, and that there was their responsibility to get rid of this corruption and get rid of this challenge to that, and push back to protect the Southern ways of life. So one of the ways that this emerged within this resistance was the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. You had it started with the Tennessee Social Club that gathered to meet and were largely plantation owners and things like that. And from there, their goals were essentially, so like you have this image here, you see, right? There's not the traditional white hoods and all that yet. The whole point was, though, you wore a hood or to cover your face so you wouldn't get in trouble when you then went and did illegal things. And the whole idea within this system, both of what becomes the KKK and which started with the Tennessee Social Club, was to be an instrument of terror, specifically to prevent Black rights. They targeted, obviously, Black people in power and voting. They also targeted anyone that was allies for Black rights. And they did this through limiting Black freedom wherever they could. The goal was to limit Black freedom. And essentially what they did is they of course called themselves the respectable citizens, and their goal was to used threats, violence, scare tactics. Oh, man. I'm going to make sure next time I have the the palm rejection up, because I obviously don't here. I don't know what's going on with this. Tactics doesn't want to stay. And murder. Okay, I guess I won't write. It's just gonna erase it. Violence, scare tactics, murder. They would intimidation. So they would go to the ballot boxes and they would stand there and watch people vote. Of course, intimidating and forcing people, even those that were white people, to vote the way they knew that this group wanted them to vote, because they would literally watch you vote and know how you voted. They would also go and try to scare and black people away so they wouldn't even vote at all. They definitely, a whole aspect of the terror was to create this fear of the violence taking place, which does eventually lead to violence, where they beat people up. They even killed people. And all of this was, again, an attempt to have all of the progress that black people had made in government and rights to be lost, because their goal was to put supporters of these plantation owners, the people and the Klan, into government positions, right? They're like, we can't lose, or we can't win fairly in elections. Then we're going to win through these terror tactics that allows the people we want to get put in place in government, so that we can reshape these laws and rules and eliminate all of the ability for black people to be in politics, for them to be able to vote as much as we can legally, and also actually threaten and kill people in the process. There were various aspects of those that were lynched, and who were their land was burned. Eventually, the Klan, when they developed, from the Tennessee Social Club to the actual Ku Klux Klan, start wearing very obvious and identifiable clothing with the pointed white hoods and the robes, so that people can see them, so that just their image was a sense of terror. That was intentionally part of that. The crazy thing with this is, what happens is that right, this is going to start off, the Klan is going to start off because they then covering their faces because they fear getting in trouble. And in fact, there is going to be northern response to this, right? It isn't just ignored in the process. What ends up happening is that because of this resistance and because of them destroying ballot boxes, that giving death threats, actually killing people, this is where lynching starts in a much more systematic way, and targeting and murdering black politically active groups, white allies. Also, they wanted to put an emphasis on sharecropping and farming. So part of the goal too was to, let's see if I can write it up here. The goal was, you started having these businesses. It's not going to let me write. I don't know why. They started having these businesses where black people were having businesses. They were being successful merchants, and they wanted to eliminate that. And again, they couldn't have the black codes again, but they're like, how can we get it as close to that as possible? Well, reinforced that the only jobs available for black men especially were sharecropping and farming, but not owning land and not having their own property, which many under congressional Reconstruction and the radical Republicans had been able to do. Because of this, the government under Grant does react. It's not like they don't do anything. They create 3 enforcement acts. And they basically, these enforcement acts were to provide federal supervision of voting, specifically saying that interfering with voting was a federal offense, right? That's still a thing today. Interfering with voting is now a federal offense. So the federal government can come in and not only supervise voting, but they can arrest people under federal law if they're interfering with this, right? And this meant that Klan members were arrested for interfering and preventing the legitimate vote. It also provided, like I said, not only making the law, which is super important because it gave them the power to arrest people and enforce it, but making sure that there was federal supervision to basically have, military power and force to prevent anyone from strong arming their way back into intimidation, right? Because it defeated the point even if they get arrested after the fact, if they intimidate and control the vote to their favor, they get arrested after the fact, but they were successful then in manipulating the voting rights. And then they also were saying that they sent military in to suspend habeas corpus rights for any states that were seen to be in a state of insurrection. So if they argued that if the states were pushing back and refusing to support the voting rights and were using intimidation and fear and interfering with that, then they had a right to come in and suspend those rights to arrest and lock up the people. And essentially with a suspension of habeas corpus, they could just lock them up and leave them locked up for a long time. And that was kind of the goal. It's like, basically, we're going to arrest you and we're going to lock you up because you're interfering with the voting rights. And then we're just going to leave you locked up until all of this is done. And then we'll figure out a court schedule, which with the right to habeas corpus, the right to a speedy trial, normally you wouldn't be able to just put them in jail and leave them there for a while. This way they could do that so that they could not interfere with the elections. That was the idea of that. Then they also created the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which said that essentially any group that infringed upon civil and political rights would be considered a federal crime. And so I guess actually the act of infringing upon civil and political rights was a federal crime. Therefore, any groups doing that could be charged with a federal crime. This led to a systematic arrest and roundup of Klan members. It was one of the more successful attempts at breaking up the Klan. Grant sent in federal troops to round up Klan's members, and they ended up occupying 9 counties in South Carolina during this time under the Ku Klux Klan Act. So there was a huge attempt and push to try to push back against Southern resistance. So why did it fail? Right? Because ultimately the Reconstruction is a failure. Because what happens? The end of Reconstruction leads to the segregated South. Okay? And the segregated South is going to have the separate but equal law, which is not true. There was no equal. They're going to have the Jim Crow laws. There's going to be extreme limitation on Black rights. There's going to be massive workarounds for, we'll say, no Black voting. While technically by the law that wasn't true, we will look at when we talk about segregation that they basically, to register to vote, they would give, even though they claimed they didn't, they would give different tests to those who were Black versus those who were white, making it almost impossible for Black voters to be able to successfully register to vote. And then, of course, again, with segregation, this also leads to, again, the massive lynching. Only this time it's all public and open, right? While the Klan started and during Reconstruction, and they were wearing the masks to cover their identity to not get charged, by the time it shifts to segregation, the Klan kind of declines, in part because of all the arrests, but it also declines because now people could openly terrorize and attack and lynch people, and they didn't have to cover their faces anymore. That's the shift, right? It gets worse, right? The Klan is bad in of itself, but it gets worse when now the situation went from these people still had to hide their faces for fear of repercussions to, after Reconstruction, people no longer had to hide their faces. In fact, they took pictures, public pictures that were made into postcards, smiling and being happy for their face to be seen, enacted in this type of violence because there was no repercussion for it. And that's one of the biggest things of where you can say, where was the failure of Reconstruction? Well, the segregated South is what happened. And all of the stuff that they were trying to prevent didn't happen, right? All of those rights that they kept trying to get and for a while did give to, or did allow the Black population to be able to get, through voting through election, it all went away again, right? So none of the things that they tried for the equality, for voting rights, for all of the rights of a citizenship, regardless of race, color, and previous conditions of servitude, just disappeared, right? So that in itself is the failure. But so let's look at why did it fail, right? Well, it failed because Republicans got tired of direct intervention. At some point, right, they basically said, this is the South's problem. We have over and over and over and over again interfered and provided direct intervention to get to South to manage itself. And every single time we do, it works for a little bit and then it fails, right? And we're tired of constantly having to push this, push this through and force this through. You know what? This is really the South's issue. We're tired. It's not that they're tired of dealing with it. This coincides with the Southern Democrats electing in a majority of House representatives. This is exactly what they wanted, right, with the government representation. If they get in enough Southern Democrats, they can make and enact and change laws, right, that essentially that's what they do. The laws now of the people are going to move towards allowing for the segregated South. Well, the Supreme Court ruling of the 15th Amendment, like there's a couple things with that. So the Supreme Court ruled that in the 15th Amendment that it did not guarantee the right to vote, and while it did technically prevent certain discrimination, and then we're going to talk about this more specifically. So right, the 15th Amendment had already come in. And then the law got taken into it, and we're going to talk about this with women and stuff next time, that they basically said it did not provide a right to vote, or perhaps an inherent right to vote. Essentially, they're going to say it's a privilege, and that the states can determine who is worthy, who is worthy of voting, and this targeted women, and we'll look at that with that, and so saying, well, no, women don't get the right to vote because it's not a guaranteed right, and states can decide who is entrusted with that right. But what it opened up to is not just rejecting women's right to vote. It essentially allowed the South to go, oh, cool, well, then we can determine who's worthy to vote by having these tests, right? And showing who understands the law, and we're going to make them ridiculously hard for Black people, even though we're going to pretend that we give it to everyone the same because separate but equal. And all of that, basically undermines the 15th Amendment and what it was supposed to do. So not only now do you have Southern Democrats in control of the government, the Republicans tired of coming in and trying to stop their intervention and terror and attacks on Black people for anyone who was successful in their eyes or doing anything outside of sharecropping and farming. But now you had the Supreme Court saying that the 15th Amendment kind of protected rights, kind of, sort of. But you can kind of do whatever, essentially allowing for what was seen as the Redeemers to be successful in taking back over the South, right? The Redeemers also we'll call like propaganda, right? They were huge on this whole glory of Southern life. The best example of this is like Gone with the Wind later. The film Gone with the Wind. And the South continues to do this through segregation. Essentially, they try to reframe and idealize traditional, basically antebellum Southern life before the Civil War, and how great the South and Southern life was before slavery was ended, before Black people got rights. And they put out this massive amount of propaganda to convince people that the good old days of the South and this culture and heritage was rooted in that antebellum structure. And this eventually, as we already talked about, led to segregation, the segregated South. And the segregated South lasts until the Civil Rights Movement, right? So this isn't a short-term thing. The 1870s all the way until the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement. Like, it's crazy how long segregation in the South took place. So a complete and utter failure in Reconstruction. And so what they push for all of this is an attempt to be like, how, again, just like the Black codes, how can we bring back the roles and structure in life of Black people as close to slavery as possible? And now sharecropping did impact poor white Southerners as well. In fact, poor white Southerners and the Black population in general in the South kind of got lumped together even more than it had been when there was slavery. And this was because, I mean, in reality, the poor white population of the South always had more in common with the slave population before the war than anyone else. And while they weren't slaves, and that's a big deal, their treatment, their quality of life was not much better than slaves, and certainly was pretty equal to, in many ways. Again, there still is a big difference with being white, gave you advantages then, and racism and all of that Black population had to deal with. But like, they were largely disdained by the wealthy plantation owners and wealthy of the South. And now both were largely regulated to sharecropping. But sharecropping was intentionally created and done as a way to bring Black people back to the plantations and farms, prevent them from being able to own their own land and farms, and instead have to work for plantation owners again. Sure, now they had to, get some of the profit. They couldn't be treated exactly like slaves. And yet, if you look at this sharecropping contract, there's a lot of things that are like, oh wait, that's like not, it's as close as they pushed it as close as they could to slavery. So it says this is a contract, right, with this, and it says that Ross is the plantation owner. Thomas Ross agrees to employ the freemen to plant and raise a crop on his plantation. Here are the rules and regulations, right, for that they would sign this contract. These are the rules and regulations of working as a sharecropper. Ross agrees to furnish the land to cultivate and a sufficient number of mules and horses, and feed them to make and house said crop, and all necessary farming utensils to carry on the same, and to give unto said freemen, whose names appear below, 1/2 of all cotton, corn, and wheat that is raised on said place for the year. So that's the difference, right? They are getting they get a percentage of the whatever they produce on the land. The other part goes to the plantation owner. But then all necessary expenses are deducted out of the crews on said crop. This is a huge deal. This is like a big loophole that basically says if there's other costs where he has to fix tools or do things on the land that they're sharecropping on, he can deduct that from their total percentage of crops that they get. And they always did. So that ultimately you did not get 50% of the crops. You got a much smaller percentage, because they would just add all these ridiculous expenses that no one could challenge, that they could then reduce the amount of money essentially through the crops that they got. So that's a huge caveat right there. And then it says, outside of the freeman's labor in harvesting, carrying to market, and selling the same, and the said freemen whose names appear agree to plant, cultivate, and raise under the management and control of the superintendents of Ross in good faith, right? And that the freedmen, they will produce clothing, medicine, food, right? They have to provide things for themselves and stuff like that. Any expenses that they incur. And then it says, should Ross furnish us with any of the above supplies or any other kind of expenses during that year, they have to pay them out of the net proceeds of their crop. So while this was meant to keep sharecroppers extremely poor, and if you were extremely poor, then you couldn't afford to pay for some of these medical bills or food sometimes, and so then the plantation owner would provide you with some of this, and then they would deduct at high rates that cost, since you didn't have the money on hand at the moment until crops were sold to purchase these things. You basically had to get them on loan, if you will, from the plantation owner, who could upcharge you ridiculous prices for this. It also says here, we furthermore bind ourselves to and with said Ross, we will do good work and labor 10 hours a day on average, winter and summer. And we further agrees that we will lose all lost time or pay the rate of $1 per day, rainy days accepted, right? And sickness and women lying in childbirth are to lose the time and account for it on the other hands of his or her part of the crop. So if you get sick or have kids, you have to pay for that lost time. We furthermore bind ourselves that we will obey the orders of said Ross and carrying out the management of crop and be docked for disobedience, which again is super vague here, right? With that of like, there, you know, now they weren't supposed to, you know, whip them and enact physical violence on them per se, and yet that law was loosely there, and people definitely were abused in sharecropping. Even if it was not as extensive as it was in slavery, it still did happen. Besides that, they're now signing these contracts saying they have to obey the orders of the plantation owner. They use penalties for being disobedient, which is vague. They have to work 10 hours a day every day, except for Sundays, and they are docked if they're sick or have children. They have to provide all their own clothing and food, right? Or they get docked if the plantation owner provides it. So it's all meant to keep them poor, keep them in a condition as close, just like the black coats. How can we put them back into a condition as close to slavery as possible? This was the attempt. Now, the black and white families sharecropped together. I mean, on the same plantations and stuff, and it was horrible conditions that kept and imposed poverty on people. It basically forced black families back under the authority of plantation owners, as had been in the past with slavery, and it was an intentional and very much thought out system that was done with the reemergence of the Southern Democrats and Southern control of the South to circumvent the 14th, 15th Amendment, and reimpose redeem the South as it says here, right? That was their goal, redeem the South, get it back to the way it used to be in the glory days as much as legally possible. Now, they did have to contend with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, so they had to do those workarounds, which is why you get sharecropping instead of slavery again. They can't reinstitute slavery legally, so they try to do as close as possible. They can't do the black codes again, but they can get as close as possible by putting in Southern Democrats into these positions, political powers, that then makes it almost near impossible during the segregated South for black people to be in positions of politics, to be able to vote, which means you're never going to change or enact that. All of this, again, is why the Reconstruction failed. So what we will look at next time is we're going to briefly look at what women in the North were doing during Reconstruction, which was trying to push for women's right to vote, how that fails and the consequences of that. And then we'll be moving on to the Gilded Age period, which, of course, right as the South is doing this and then falling into the segregated South period, the North is having a second industrial revolution, and it's significantly changing the way of life in the North. You're going to have massive increase in wealth with these like millionaires, as well as a massive increase in poverty in the cities at the same time. So we're gonna look at both of those components in the next few lectures.